Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar once again raised the issue of India's membership to the United Nations Security Council. He says former PM Jawaharlal Nehru prioritized China over India in membership to the UNSC. Now, the UNSC is the world's most exclusive club. It hosts the 5 permanent members. They are the victors of the Second World War. This club has largely stayed in this form for nearly 80 years. That is since 1945. It's only had 2 membership changes since then. The first in 1971, when the People's Republic of China replaced Taiwan. The second change was in 1991, when the Russian Federation replaced the former Soviet Union. But does the composition of the UNSC reflect the current geopolitical state of play? The world's most populous democracy and the world's 4th largest economy is a notable exception. And joining me to discuss this conundrum are Ambassador T.S. Tirumurthy and my colleague Aditya Raj Kaul. Ambassador Tirumurthy, welcome to the News9 Plus show. I will start by asking you this: why is China keen on blocking India's passage into the UNSC? 4 out of 5 UNSC members want us in, China wants us out.
No, I think, China and India have been rivals, and we continue to be rivals. And from a position of engagement, you have seen what has happened in the last 3-4 years. So therefore, it's not going to be an easy relationship with China in the foreseeable future. And but more than that, I think China also sees India as something which is very different from its own. Here is an equally big country, and we are becoming a very successful country. We are becoming a major power economically and otherwise, and militarily as well. But at the same time, unlike China, we are also a democracy. Yeah. We are a pluralistic country. We have human rights. We have a whole lot of other things going for us. We have freedoms, which, so I think when you look at it, here is a very successful country, a neighbor of China, as big as China, if not more. And then at the same time, we are having a different polity, a different ethos and a set of values. And I think that is for China, which is more irksome than, anything else. And that's why I think, apart from the rivalry which we have had, and we have had the recent clashes over the last decade, but this is also an important consideration for China. That's the way I look at it. Right,
absolutely. And Aditya, what's your take on this? As Ambassador Tirumurthy mentioned, the fact that China's rivalry is keeping us out of the P5, the most exclusive club in the world. As long as you have standoffs with them on the border, do you see this ever happening, an Indian seat at the UNSC, or will there be extraneous factors, pressures of the G4, for instance, the 4 countries who want to get in, which will actually open the doors?
Firstly, there are 2 or 3 things that we need to keep in mind. At this juncture in history, it's very much clear that if there's one country across the globe that actually belongs to the P5 or the P6, if at all there's a reform, it is India. Right. And I don't say it as an Indian, I don't say it as a journalist, I say it factually. I say it because India is the largest contributor in the United Nations every way possible. From not just the soft power yoga day, but contributing in every way possible, from even at the UN security level, giving the highest number of soldiers out there across the conflict-ridden regions. Right. But another fact that needs to be largely discussed is the failure of the United Nations to bring in any kind of a conflict resolution. Right. 2 of the recent examples are the Russia-Ukraine war and the situation in Gaza. Right. The UN Secretary General keeps on speaking about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, but why has the UN failed to bring in any kind of consensus, any kind of peace? Why do countries like India have to step in at the G20 to bring in some kind of a consensus? Right. That means G20, G4 and other such multilateral forums hold much more mechanism and much more power to in fact bring in some kind of a conflict resolution rather than UN.
Ambassador Tirumurthy, a valid point there. The fact that the toothlessness of the United Nations has been debated ad nauseum, the fact that it's failed to prevent 2 of the biggest conflicts. While this is still the case, then why, the dichotomy, why does India want to enter a body which is so completely toothless, incapable of preventing conflict of the kind that we are seeing in Russia, Ukraine and Israel and the Hamas in Gaza?
No, I just, if you permit, I just have one small point to make on the earlier question.
Yes.
See, there is no P6
Right.
Because this is not just about India. The expansion of the Security Council goes beyond India.
Right.
I think what EM is saying and is absolutely correct is that whenever it is expanded, we'll be there.
Yes.
But it is not just about India. It goes to
Right.
Africa, which is no representation, Latin America, and a whole lot of other
Yes.
things. So I think here we have every aspirant, so to say,
Yes.
including India, being stopped by some country or the other.
Right.
You know, we may have China as a rival, but we also have, other countries like Brazil has Mexico, and you have Germany being stopped by Russia and others. You have Japan, which is, of course, China. So I think this is something we need to keep in mind, that whenever the expansion is slightly larger than just about India.
Right.
And as far as the United Nations is concerned, yes, absolutely, they have been, they have failed on many fronts. And the Security Council, see, I don't want to get into the United Nations. That's slightly
Yes.
larger than the Security Council.
Right.
So I presume your question is really about the Security Council.
Yes.
And but let us also not forget that more than 100 small countries, they can be small island states or others,
Yes.
they need the United Nations to have a voice.
Right.
They need a world forum.
Yes.
And in these plurilateral and small forums and all that, they are not there. Where are all these small countries in G20? They are not
Yes.
there.
Right.
So I think we have to be a little bit more mindful when we talk about this,
Yes.
because small groupings are good for big countries. And the second is international law is done only in the Security Council.
Yes.
Very rarely is it done outside, whether it's UNCLOS or the UNFCCC, climate change, or law of sea. So I think this is important for us to keep in mind. Even the sustainable development goals, for example,
Yes.
came to the UN to be done.
Right.
And it was, in fact, countries like India and Brazil insisted it comes to the UN and should not be decided outside,
Right.
like the MDGs.
Right.
And finally, to say that, let us not forget that even in Gaza and all that, the examples which you are giving, the point is that ultimately when there is going to be a resolution, you have to fall back on UN Security Council
Yes.
Resolution 242 and 338.
Right.
You have to fall back on Resolution 181. You have to fall back on the resolution passed in 2016 against
Yes.
illegal settlement. So therefore, yes, it is completely paralyzed now.
Yes.
The P5s are playing their own games,
Right.
but I'm not so sure that it is completely defunct and that we should not be getting into it. Let's put it that way.
Right, absolutely. It still matters. But Aditya, Foreign Minister Jaishankar made a very important point today about the fact that former Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru said that China first and not India. Is this politics ahead of the elections, or is this been the government stance all through?
For the BJP, this has been a consistent stand.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think we should look at it more from a political prism because of the Lok Sabha elections that are there.
Right.
Of course, the history is testimony to the fact, what happened in regard to Kashmir at the UN, who brought that out. We've debated that ad nauseum. But, apart from China also, there are several various issues. And there are technicalities. For instance, when UN was really formed,
Yes.
and these 5 countries actually became the P5, they themselves decided that they are going to rule or govern the UN mechanism.
Yes.
And today we are living in a very different time.
Yes.
Just like Jaishankar actually spoke yesterday in Rajkot with the Intellectual Forum, that today's times demand that there need to be reforms. In fact, with Ambassador Tirumurthy, we made a very brilliant documentary called Unmasked.
Yes.
That actually speaks about the reforms that are required, and also
Right.
how the UN has failed to counter terrorism.
Right.
That India has time and again, during Ambassador Tirumurthy's time, before that and after that, raised at the UN level how reforms, how countering terrorism, and how a consensus and new members in the P5 are absolutely required with the changing times.
Right, absolutely. New members are required, and it's only a matter of time before the P5 becomes, as Ambassador Tirumurthy said, the P9 possibly by the end of this decade, if not earlier. But Ambassador Tirumurthy, just run us through this thing of history, since history is the elephant in the room that keeps being invoked. The fact that India was offered the UN Security Council seat in the 50s by first the United States and then by the USSR, but we declined. We said pehle aap. It's not very clear on that. But is this was this just slogans? Was it rhetoric, or was there anything more to these invitations to join the UNSC, or just politics?
No, I think the touchstone I would think of, because I don't have too much of facts. I can only give you my opinion.
Right.
Now the thing is, the touchstone which you have is
Yes.
that how credible was the ability of these countries
Yes.
to get you the UN Security Council seat.
Right. Right.
Yes, maybe the United States and UK may have offered it, Russia may have offered it. The point is
Yes.
that they have been in a position to get you the Security Council seat.
Right.
So therefore, I think whatever the decision making was at that time, they probably decided that I think they would not be able to get the seat even if these countries had pushed it, or that the offers which we got were not credible enough.
Right.
I think that was the decision taken. It is very difficult for me to put myself into their shoes,
Yes.
or the Honorable Prime Minister of that time to decide.
Right.
And for example, I'll just give you an example which is more in a lighter vein.
Yes.
We have 4 countries out of 5 supporting us.
Yes.
Now, why haven't we taken it?
Right.
Because you know very well that there are other issues involved. And it is not just about China. It is about expansion in all categories, both the
Yes.
permanent category and the non-permanent category. So there is obviously a certain credibility factor here that we know we are not getting it now. Otherwise, 50 years later, someone will say that in 2024, we did not accept the Security Council seat. So I think we have to take this with a pinch of salt.
Right.
But I don't know the facts, but I can only guess that maybe the offer was not credible enough at that time for us to take it and make it meaningful.
Right, absolutely. The offer may not have been credible at that point for us to accept it, as Ambassador Tirumurthy just said. But thank you very much for joining us this evening, Ambassador Tirumurthy. For more on that story, on the expansion of the United Nations Security Council, you can watch our documentary, Unmasked.
Our country faced the horrors of terror long before the world took serious note of it. Over the decades, terrorism, in different names and forms, tried to hurt India.
During COVID, we had unrelenting cross-border terrorism from Pakistan.
ये तय करें कि ये चीजें हैं जिसे हम terrorism कहते हैं.
Tell me one problem that the UN has solved.
Fighting terrorism is a central priority for the action of the United Nations.
The UN has a folk tongue. They speak with several tongues.
Streaming on News9 Plus, news is now content. Subscribe and get free vouchers.